My name is Elliot Visconti. I'm also from Notre Dame. I'm delighted to be moderating our second roundtable here. I have the honor to serve as the university's Associate Provost and Chief Academic Digital Officer, but in doing some administrative work. But my background is in the English department, so I'm an English PhD, and I teach and write about the First Amendment as well. So I think about some of these questions that we saw previewed for us in the last panel, and just to give you a little bit of background, what we're going to do for this second panel, I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly. I have a series of questions that we circulate in advance. I'll explain some of those, and then we'll move into what will hopefully be an interactive discussion, both with our panel and with all of you. So our second panel considers the potential impact, sorry, let me rephrase. So we've got Dr. Matt Turek, Jessica Silby, Kaveh Waddle, and Kirsten Martin. Matt is from DARPA, Jessica BU, Kaveh is from Axios, and Kirsten's from George Washington University. They each will introduce themselves very briefly in a sentence or less when we get to their remarks. So our second panel considers the potential impact of deepfake technology on national security and democratic self-governance, some of the stuff we just were starting to explore last panel. In many ways, this topic, deepfakes themselves, is the ideal topic to inaugurate Notre Dame's Center for Technology Ethics. Thank you all for coming to help us do that work. The genre, of visual fiction pretending to be fact is in fact nothing new. And this genre is creating new challenges to democracy, to political stability, trust in evidence, and the legitimacy of information. Flourishing of deepfake technology and the potentially devastating impact of carefully timed disinformation attacks using deepfakes may prompt reform movements of the law, reform movements directed at platforms, or indeed of the underlying information architectures of the internet. The advent of deepfakes may prompt other reform movements as well, social, cultural, and so forth. It is clear, however, that both the potential problems presented and the remedies are at once technical, sociocultural, and political. As we heard before, this is not a technical problem with technical solutions, and so forth. It is that nexus of the technical, the sociocultural, and the political that our panelists today will explore together, both as colleagues and with you, the audience. So in order to launch our roundtable, and before we got together this morning, I provided our panelists with some directional questions, some broad questions, and they will, as they know, they have plenty of autonomy to address these. And just for order of operations, what will happen, I'll describe the questions in a moment. Each of our panelists will speak for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we will open it up to discussion immediately thereafter. So the questions that we thought would animate a discussion this morning are as follows. First, what threats does deepfake technology pose to democratic institutions and democratic values within a networked and global public sphere? So for institutions, we might think about elections, we heard earlier, rule of law, the open media architectures of the internet, premises of self-government, democratic legitimacy, and so forth. For values, we might think about pluralism, deliberation, counterspeech, trust, legitimacy. Number 2, how do deepfakes exploit immediacy, high velocity, in order to create harm, right? How does the timescale matter? What kind of counterspeech, what kind of ex post facto remediation is plausible within a media architecture of instant global distribution? 3, should the US stockpile weapons-grade deepfake technology? Should the US use it as an offensive cyber weapon? What might the rules of engagement be? So for you fans of Dr. Strangelove, can we afford a deepfake gap? I'm just being silly. I had to say that. 4, what are the appropriate legal, political, and sociocultural tools, methods available to mitigate the harms created by weaponized political deepfakes used by, for example, non-state actors, amateurs, and so forth, professional hackers? What role can industry or organizations play? 5, is it legally permissible to regulate deepfakes? What kind of arguments might deepfake creators use successfully to defend their creations? Can deepfakes be literature, art, parody, satire, some very well-protected forms of creativity under the First Amendment? 6, what are the costs of algorithmic prior restraint and or the consequences of devolving the responsibilities for deepfake detection and removal to platform providers? And 7, how could ubiquitous deepfake technology and the low-friction, high-velocity distribution of deepfakes prompt a rethinking of Section 230? How could it prompt a rethinking of aspects of First Amendment doctrine or other legal forms, and should it? So those are some of the frameworks and questions that I asked our panelists to reflect on. As I said, they have plenty of autonomy within that. So what we're going to do is just go serially down the line. Each of our speakers will speak for a couple of minutes and then right into discussion. So without further ado, Dr. Matt Turek from DARPA. Matt.
Good morning. My name is Matt Turek. I'm a program manager at DARPA. So for those of you that don't know, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. We're technically part of the Department of Defense. We were founded in 1958 in response to Sputnik, and the goal of the organization is to prevent strategic surprise for the U.S. I'm actually really privileged, I feel really privileged to be a part of that organization. There's a really dedicated group of individuals working at DARPA to further that mission of preventing strategic surprise. So at DARPA, I own a couple programs. One is the Media Forensics Program, or Metaphor, that Ed and Pat are both part of and mentioned earlier, and an upcoming Semantic Forensics Program. I also happen to own a couple other core AI programs on explainable AI and machine common sense. So that's my background. I guess the other caveat that I'll offer is I'm not a policy guy, I'm not a legal guy. So I come at this much more from the perspective of the first panel, sort of the technology piece, but happy to sort of bring that flavor to this discussion.
I'm Jessica Silby. I'm pleased to be associated with Danielle at BU, but I teach at Northeastern University of Law, also in Boston, though, so we are neighbors and colleagues in that way. That's totally fine. I'm also an affiliate professor of the English department, and I have a background in literature and film studies as well. Are we doing our openings now or no? Yeah. Okay, all right. So in the vein of interdisciplinary legal and humanities studies, what I want to suggest sort of as an opening foray is that we think a lot about whether it's true or not, whether the fake is a fake. And I think one thing we really also have to think about is what kind of story is being told by the fake. That is, it's not only false facts that undermine all the different things that we are holding dear today, but the nature of the stories that are being told with those false facts. And the stories that are being told with those facts are stories that are available stories, dominant stories about gender, sex, and violence, and abuse of power. And I think we just have to realize that there are very particular genres of deepfakes that circulate widely. And we have to ask the questions about why those are the ones that are causing so much harm. The idea that these are available stories. I mean, one of the harms of deepfakes that as I understand, as someone who thinks about narrative and law, is that anything that gets divorced from its context, whether it's a tweet or a video, can mean almost anything you want it to mean. You put it in a new context, and when it doesn't have a context, the thing that gets mapped onto it are the available scripts in culture. And so I think one of the really hard things to deal with about fighting back against deep fakes is to figure out how to make different stories available and as dominant as the ones that we are seeing today. So that is not only about generating more stories that talk back to the stories that the dominant deep fakes tell, that is making those as available, but it's also thinking about the structures in which deep fakes circulate, that is the institutions and the actual technical structures that facilitate certain stories from being viral and other stories not. So if you think about how deepfakes work, which is they're consumptive, they're addictive, and they're capitalistic, there are certain stories that circulate faster in that structure, for example. Deepfakes, many of them, their purpose is to denigrate and to dominate ideologically or physically So what about our sociology feeds those stories more than others? I think we have to think hard about, it's a cultural problem as much as it is a technological problem. And then there's the design problem of deepfakes, which is when you take anything out of context, whether again it's a word or an image, the design of how deepfakes travel is that it separates the maker from the subject, from the distributor, from its audience. And so that total disaggregation that goes on is part of what makes deepfakes so scary, I think. It's actually like a virus, right? You just don't know where it is. And that is the design of the internet. That is actually one of the benefits of the internet, and it is the risks of it. And so I think one of the things that we also might want to think about is reconceiving how the internet is, part of what the internet is like our environment. It is we have a shared fate in clean air and clean water. We have a shared fate in a functioning internet that doesn't produce violence and dominance. But really the language around the internet is about freedom and about autonomy and about all these things that is not actually about community building as much as it is about individual freedom. And I think changing that story would matter a lot to figuring out other ways of combating deepfakes. I'll end there.
Thank you. I'm Kaveh. I'm a reporter at Axios. I write about AI and emerging technologies, and synthetic media is a big part of that. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the threat to media, to journalism from synthetic media. I think there are two big threats. There's the threat that that you become kind of an unintentional vector for misinformation, and that's obviously always been at the core of journalism, that you have to verify and make sure that you're only spreading the truth, and that just becomes more difficult with technology that makes it more easier to cover up distruth. And then there's the danger that you become the target of something like a sting, in an environment where there's a lot of distrust of media, and there are folks who would try to expose journalists. There's a way of presenting deepfakes as a hoax, and we saw just this week ABC made a big mistake and circulated a video that was taken in Kentucky as if it were from Syria, and the story behind that is still fairly vague, but it would seem that it came from a source who said it came from Syria, and the due diligence wasn't put in, and so that's a big threat to the legitimacy of media, which is already under attack. I think that brings up two big questions that journalism has to figure out around synthetic media. One of them is how to cover it, and the other is when to cover it. The how to cover it is well, you see, for example, newsrooms like the Wall Street Journal putting a lot of money and energy and time into training journalists about how to cover deepfakes and how to detect deepfakes, and that's great, but not every newsroom has that kind of those resources, and in fact, probably the newsrooms that don't have those kinds of resources are those that are most at risk of falling for something like that. So I'm thinking about local journalists, for example, whose newsrooms have fewer and fewer resources, and journalists who spend a lot of time aggregating. So they're taking content that they find on social media, repackaging it, maybe not putting a lot of thought into verifying it, perhaps because they don't have time, and then they become a vector. And so for folks like that, I think it's particularly important just to have kind of a baseline awareness of what is possible and where the technology is, and maybe it's not as necessary to have a forensics team on call like the Journal might, but instead to be able to fall back on traditional reporting, the kinds of verification, source checking, double checking that that journalism is built on. That really that's the kind of reporting that I think becomes particularly important in this context. And the other big question that's particularly difficult, I think, is when to cover a deepfake. I think we're past the point at which synthetic media is sort of inherently newsworthy, and so it's not a bunch of stories about Nick Cage's face on various actors anymore, but rather there's an important question about sort of the journalist's role in spreading something. And so I think about the cheap fake, as it were, or the easy manipulation of the Speaker Pelosi video from a few months back. And the fact that a lot of the reporting on it came when it was still relatively obscure. A lot of the first news stories about it came when it had not been viewed very many times yet. And then after that, of course, it was viewed a whole bunch. That's perhaps a different story because of how basic the edits were, like the previous panel said, old editing technology, the kinds of changes you could make decades ago. But in the future, I think that's a really difficult question that journalists will have to ask themselves, which is, at one point, am I reporting on something newsworthy, and at what point am I making it newsworthy by writing about it? So I don't think anyone's got great answers about that, but those are the kinds of questions that it's useful to answer ahead of time, so that in the moment when you find something perhaps that hasn't spread terribly far, when you're thinking about the competing imperatives of speed and maybe you want a scoop or something, versus being very careful about your role in spreading information. It's good to have something to fall back on. So.
Great, thank you. My name is Kirsten Martin. I'm a professor in the business school where I study privacy and technology within business ethics, so usually around the corporate responsibility of privacy and technology. And I want to pick up a little bit on what Jessica said, is trying to put this in the framework of what we already know, how the way the internet works is somehow exacerbating this. And to say that forgery, fake videos, deepfakes, can be seen within a larger movement to manipulate users online. So we have misinformation, bad information, slightly modified information. And that is effective right now because of hyper-targeting. So whoever wants to manipulate is able to target people who are vulnerable to that manipulation, who want to hear that story. And people who are aware of the alternative story are not ever seeing it, right? This is how some of the stuff around the 2016 elections. But even now, by the time someone who was in the room and actually saw Pelosi or someone else who is aware of the actual history could speak up, it's already viral, right? So this hyper-targeting allows the fake videos to remain under the radar screen and go viral before someone else can pull the plug. In the old days, back when there were like 3 TV stations and it was by a dial that you had to go to the TV and turn on, fake videos and fake information were actually seen by everyone at the same time. So a reporter for the whatever Axios wasn't around back then, but New York Times would have, this is back in the 80s, would have been able to report immediately and say, take down that video, that's a fake video, or somebody else would be able to say it. And right now we have trouble because of this hyper-targeting and the amount of information that certain companies have about us to be able to target who will believe this ad, who is vulnerable to this ad or this video or this misinformation. Okay, so if fake videos are part of a larger effect to manipulate, similar to fraud and coercion, bribery, these are all manipulation techniques, why do we fight them so hard in the real world? And I want to suggest that these types of fake information, fake videos, deepfakes, are actually more insidious than just an annoyance or a targeting of vulnerable populations, because we fight fraud, bribery, coercion, deception in the non-internet world because individuals' choice is actually fundamental to how everything works. It's how our politics works, social choice works, economics works, it's how our markets work. And the idea is so fundamental that we actually theorists don't even mention it. They'll just say free markets and free choice. And because of this, we actually have an efficient market. The best product wins, the best firm wins. The outcome of an election is the best person wins. And because of this fundamental role of choice, it actually not only gives us the efficiency, but there's actually a legitimacy that comes with it, right? So every single transaction, the idea that we have a legitimate market is because every single transaction that underpins that market is actually legitimate. And so if you ask someone at the SEC or the FBI, like, why do you go after fraud? They'll immediately say, do you like a functioning market? I mean, that's really what they're going for. And so that's why we spend millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of people fighting fraud, even when there's no tangible harm necessarily. It's because legitimacy of the market and efficiency of the market. So that's to say, this ability to hyper-target people around deepfakes and fake manipulative videos should be, we should be the canaries of the coal mine to say this could become a major problem if it kind of undermines the legitimacy of market or political outcomes, because we've seen the effect of how it can be targeted to vulnerable populations. And so that combination, I think, is especially problematic, both from a business school's perspective, so for markets and economics and how things work, but also, as the point of this panel, is kind of the political legitimacy that we have within the United States. So that's my uplifting message of the day.
And just take the opportunity to jump in on that. I really like that comment. I kind of want to actually amplify it, though. I mean, it's more than just markets. These are fundamentally an attack on knowledge, right? Which underpins everything that we do, right? So the finance community, but this undermines science. It undermines commerce. It undermines just basic human trust. So, these aren't just political attacks. These aren't just targeted military attacks. This has the potential to undermine our trust in anything. Would you conduct a banking transaction or purchase something if you had no trust? Any of your credit card transactions is just based on the fact that you believe that a payment is being transferred and the vendor believes that payment's being transferred. The ability to distort knowledge at scale is going to potentially have really broad-based impacts if we don't figure out how to deal with it.
Thanks, Matt. So just I'll exercise moderator's prerogative and ask if the panelists would like to propose perhaps some initial remedies or strategies for our collective discussion, given the velocity challenge, the hyper-targeting challenge, the erosion of trust in knowledge, and the community norms that are potentially imperiled. What might be some initial steps that we should propose for discussion to try and remedy this problem?
That was not on your list of questions.
I know. It's number 8. Yes.
Oh, is it? That's right.
Kind of in there.
Well, I'll just jump in and say one of the things that's going on in my university that I think is working hard to understand that authentication, questions of truth and facts, are a part of a larger social process. That is, authenticating what is true or not has everything to do with trusting the institutions that are doing the verification, for example, and trusting the process by which that verification happens. And one of the things that's going on at Northeastern is that almost all our computer scientists and engineers are now being forced to take courses in social sciences and the humanities that understands media studies, cultural studies, anthropology, political science, government, which is very challenging because in computer science and engineering, for example, those courses, a 4.5-year course load usually is already pretty overbooked. But the deans of the engineering school and the computer science school have collaborated to basically make cross minors for all our graduates in the technology to understand the social processes by which the technology in which the technology is situated and can be used. So there's one way of thinking about this is to make sure that people are not isolated in the things they make.
One of the things we heard on the last panel is about how what the process looks like when something that appears to be synthetic media pops up on a social network like Facebook, and the role of automated flagging, and then the role of the human in the loop. Now that can be a slow process. We saw, for example, with the Speaker Pelosi video that took I think more than 24 hours in that case. There is, I think there are a lot of questions about what platforms can do since they are often the first line of defense. They're the first ones that see essentially, whether it's a person or a machine, that see the synthetic piece of media. And there, there are shades of gray about what's to be done and how much human involvement there should be, but there could potentially be some sort of immediate labeling, something, this is in question. Our algorithms think this is in question, but maybe the people haven't taken a look at it yet. So there are certain ways that you might sort of try to apply a design solution to the very first hour problem before you can call in reinforcements.
I was actually thinking the same thing. It's almost, I thought it was interesting to think about how spam used to be a problem, and it's sometimes helpful to remember back when we had other intractable problems, like you couldn't make steel without pollution, or we had the spam problem. Businesses have faced these types of issues in the past. This isn't, it's not novel for businesses to all of a sudden see that there's some sort of harm coming from their business model and then initially say, I don't know if we can fix it alone, and then they kind of figure out how to fix it. So I actually have hope that these things are fixable. I think one argument, a normative argument, is around why platforms are the first line of defense. And this is almost the argument of if you see someone on the side of the road, you don't have to be a mechanic to try to stop and help them. You're the first line of defense to help them. But I think I would actually take a stronger point of saying that the way that hyper-targeting works within these platforms, they actually are enabling this. This makes it more of a positive duty, that not that they just shouldn't stop, drive by the person on the side of the road, but did they put the nails to stop the car and cause part of the harm? So part of this isn't that they tried to cause the harm, it's more of part of this, it's important to remember, is enabled by this hyper-targeting and not flagging. And I actually was thinking the same thing just coming in this morning about how you could just put up something that just says unverified. Until it's, and so it's just a permanent thing that says unverified. And I do believe that they'll figure out a way to find and remove the unverified faster when given market incentives.
So we have left plenty of times for questions. Mark.
Thanks for a great start. So I wanted to tie together Jessica's and Kirsten's comments there, and both talking about the hyper-targeting and then also thinking about the stories that are told here. And so we are hearing and will hear a lot, even especially in the next panel, about the harms that come from some of these technologies, appropriately so. But I think it's often important to also talk about who benefits from the circulation of these things, and I wondered if I could get you all to sort of reflect on that a little bit, because these things circulate because certain people get something out of that, right? Whether that's the business model that is benefiting from the fact that these things are circulating and at the velocity that they are, or the people who create them get something out of them. And so it might be useful, I think, just to think about, in terms of responses, not just thinking about what the harms are, but who benefits from them and where the pain points might be, and actually instituting some responses.
Well, but I'll say, obviously, I think that the platforms benefit when there's a just under a destructive amount of the virality, and so keeping it going, but not so bad that all of a sudden the reputation of the platforms has been destroyed, is probably an optimal business model for many of them. So I'd say that and also advertisers benefit as well. But one of the things that I also want to say about that is we also like to think that there are all these trade-offs between the First Amendment and free speech and freedom versus safety and I just want to suggest that those are false trade-offs, and that free speech has never been always free, and the platforms have always regulated, and our society has always been regulated. And so one of the things that's missed here is just the other values that are underneath a lot of this that are missed. So equality, for example, right? Equal treatment, nonviolence. These are, and the next panel will talk about that, but we can't just say one value. When you say the benefit is a functioning market, for example, a functioning market might actually also oppress and violently oppress a whole group of people. And so I think we have to really make it more nuanced than benefits versus harms, as there are lots of benefits to choose from and lots of harms to worry about.
Well, I mean, I think that's an excellent point. I think that there's part of manipulation is that it's the bending of the target's will towards the person who benefits from it. There's always someone that's doing it on purpose. Either it's a narrative that they're trying to promote because they get a better identity out of it, so if it's targeting of vulnerable populations or putting out a misogynistic narrative, and that makes them feel better, or they're targeting someone for their will of who they think should win, an election or advertising campaign. I mean, so there's always, there is a winner, and I think but your point is well taken, that there's usually advertisers or platforms that are also benefiting from eyeballs on the platform or eyeballs on the web page, and that is part of the model, as Jessica pointed out, the model of how the internet works right now. That plus the hyper-targeting makes it so that it's almost, I think there was a work a while ago around a certain amount of forgeries that actually trademarks want because it makes their stuff popular.
Yeah.
And so your argument reminded me of that argument that for some people they want a certain amount of eyeballs no matter how they get them, but below a certain threshold. Or as will come up in the next panel, targeted to certain people who don't necessarily have a voice, and therefore it's not that threshold. There could be more videos and the threshold won't be reached if it's targeting towards certain people. If there are other people that were being targeted, I think that they would figure out deepfakes pretty fast. I mean, just if you think, anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Other questions? Let's see, we had.
And on your discussion about sort of this corruption of the marketplace, impacts of our marketplace, the earlier panel, is kind of focusing on sort of content comparisons and anomaly detection as a way to determine whether whether you have a deep fake. And I'm wondering whether or not that you guys or any of you are suggesting that this is more about data integrity, provenance, and pedigree. And in particular, perhaps Matt may comment on whether or not any of these approaches for auditing, whether it's blockchain or any other source of audit trailing, have been shown to be of any use to describe this.
Yeah, I think let's say digital provenance solutions are certainly digital provenance solutions are certainly, I think, of interest. There are startups and others working on those sorts of approaches. I think one of the challenges is that you have to wait for that to basically become pervasive in the marketplace, right? So will cell phones in the Mideast have built-in provenance? And if so, when do you expect that that's going to happen? If we're going to rely on that, that means that every form of, let's say, acquiring media and transmitting it needs to respect that. So while I think we need to work towards that, I don't think that that's really going to be a scalable, feasible solution anytime soon. So I think we're still going to require the ability to automatically look at media and do things like flagging and filtering and prioritizing for human review. I think ultimately, one good way to deploy that is to think about these sorts of techniques like a spam filter, right? So we use that sort of technology already to deal with a volume of maybe less adversarial attacks, but certainly the volume of spam requires automated solutions. I think we're going to see the need for those automated solutions also on manipulated and falsified media.
You can shout if you want, but it's coming.
Thank you, Catherine Harrison. Listening to the last panel and this panel, I see a lot of parallels for the technology industry with healthcare, whether it be the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath for technologists or nutrition labels for content. What do you think it will take to get the key actors to start to think about some of those solutions? And do you think we've reached the Sputnik moment, or are we still waiting for it?
All right, I'm gonna jump in on that. I don't know that we've seen the Sputnik moment. I think it could get worse from here still.
I think this sort of goes to one of the comments that Kirsten made about, the internet is exacerbating this. I would argue really it's the incentive structure around how we use the underlying technology. I think there's a place for all of us as part of that community to try and realign that incentive structure. If we valued the quality of information and communication and trust in the platforms that we used as opposed to sort of speed, which I think is kind of where we are now, I think we'd have the opportunity to perhaps shift how the platforms behave or create the space for new platforms that were better aligned with what we want.
The next panel, I think, will talk about this a little bit more, but I think fast change could happen if certain laws were reformed. That's threatening to a lot of platforms in many ways, and that threat has been made by lawmakers today. You see that in the healthcare debate too. Whether that's a negotiating game or whether a law comes down and changes the way the internet is regulated, I think that's very much a possibility. But I'm not making any predictions.
I think Jessica had a good point about educating engineers in engineering schools. I think which I agree with. I was an engineer as an undergrad. I had to take those 2 courses as well, and I coded my first few years. The issue, I think, is that a lot of people that end up coding or working on these are not brought in at an even engineering schools, and then you don't have 100% compliance on the engineering school. So you might have just a general engineering ethics course, but you don't have one on AI and fairness or something along those lines. I actually think a better bottleneck point to focus on would be at the companies that are actually making it. And so similar to a civil engineer has to be a professionalization of a civil engineer, and that if you're at a construction company, you have to have an architect or a civil engineer that's professionalized and has professional responsibilities apart from the firm that they're working for. It could be that there are requirements to have a certain computer science engineer professionalization on any given project that then signs off on that project and has their own sets of criteria. Statisticians do this. I mean, there's other places where we have a professionalization that then brings them an obligation outside of the company that they then have to be beholden to. And so that would capture people that don't go to like an engineering school that actually teaches it, that just either learned it on their own or went to information systems. I mean, there's other ways to learn coding as well. So that is one place that I think has promise. That would be a pressure point, if you were going to force that type of thinking, is to force professionalization, but it would have to be at the company level.
So that's such an interesting point. I just want to amplify the idea that there are professional standards in healthcare, for example, professional standards for lawyers. You get certified. Right. You have to, in internet, in these kind of platforms, this is a very, libertarian world. For all the reason, and people celebrate that for sure, but the idea that maybe the time is coming that there are external auditing procedures, external credentialing, if you're going to be a kind of platform that distributes its content.
I think there's kind of an interesting model in media in that there's not a credentialing system. There's not really like a structure whereby you're answerable to some body, but rather there's kind of a fairly set code of ethics that's widely understood, that generally members of this community hold each other to. I mean, obviously that goes way back, and so it's difficult to sort of impose wholesale on a
Which
new.
the internet has very much challenged.
Yeah, totally. And so I think that's an interesting but difficult model.
It is. I think, the other thing that's different is that your name is on your product to the market, and so there's a market system that works. Sometimes when we have issues that there's no lever in the market to correct bad behavior, we have to come up with alternatives. Sometimes we heavily regulate what they can and can't do. Professionalization is one of those mechanisms that, because it's not like you put Kirsten Martin's name on the code that goes out, and then I'm in trouble if it doesn't work. I mean, that would work too. They could have to put their names on it.
We do this all the time with
Right.
infrastructure, whether it's bridges.
Yes, bridges, yes, civil
this
engineers.
This is not a big brother coming in and regulating.
Right.
These are independent auditing mechanisms by which we try to keep each other safe, right? So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, in the back. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is largely for Professor Syllabi, but everyone. You talked about how this is actually kind of at its core a cultural problem, right? It's about promoting or amplifying or already entrenched, pre-existing, say broadly, bad values, right? I realize that's a very blanket. Yeah, certain harms. So it seems to me that one way in general of combating that kind of thing is by promoting competing narratives. Yes. And what if the most effective way, the most convincing way of promoting those competing narratives is through manipulated media? In other words, is it really the truth we're after, or is it an improved culture? And to what extent do deepfakes should they be used by, and again, I'm using a broad term here, the good guys, in order to reform culture?
So I care less about whether it's true or not true. That's what I said. I care about what stories are being told. And so the idea of manipulated media, I mean, deep fakes harm because they pretend to be true when they are not. And so there is a question of the evidentiary value of it. You think about, but you can have a true video, a true photograph in a court of law, and 2 or 3 different lawyers can make it mean completely different things. What it stands for will be different depending on whose stories. And so I think more about which stories have purchase and how do we get the ones that we think are going to do the least harm to rise to the top as the stories that are the ones that we feel most comfortable with and are more true than others. I'm not a relativist at all. I mean, there are facts and there are falsehoods, but there are lots of different perspectives on true facts. And I think that we really have to work hard to develop counter-narratives, alternative narratives. So this is where diversity and inclusion in the tech industry, diversity and inclusion in media matters so much, because the more diverse stories circulate, I think the more choices we have to elevate the ones that we think are going to do less harm than more. And I think we can all agree that the fakes that we worry, at least the ones I worry the most about, are the ones that are doing harm, and that's what we're going to hear, to people and to our institutions that sustain our society. You know, those are circulating because those stories are the strongest ones.
So again, great panel. Thanks for all the comments and thoughts on this. So if we think about this, we talked about market, and there's a notion of a producer and a consumer, right? Producer of fake content or real content as a consumer. There are incentives tied to it, and then there's a platform. Now, let's say certain platforms may volunteer to constrain or to restrain some of the proliferation of these deep fakes or misinformation. But then there are these other platforms like 4chan or 8chan that pop up, and the market moves to those alternate platforms. And with the internet, there's a flattening of the world where the regulations are not consistent. There's no boundaries attached to these regulations. So how do we now tackle that? So does that lead to censorship on some voices on some platforms, and certain platforms are not applying any censorship? So what's the regulatory or legal thinking on this?
Everyone's looking at me. Should there be regulations on like 8chan or 4chan, or if we're just guessing that they're not going to self-regulate? Yes. So I think there's a producer of the video and there's the consumer of the video, but then there's also the target in the video that's an important other person that could be not a part of the transaction at the moment, and but doesn't have a voice in that transaction. Does that make sense? So I think that would be the lever to bring forward the target in the video and make sure that their interests are being served by the video going around. So that would be the lever by which I could see people coming in and actually, if it's not being self-regulated, having a mechanism to regulate that. Because Jessica, and we could speak better on this, but the idea of, we don't rely on 8chan or 4chan or any other social networking site to be the arbiter of freedom of speech. It's the government. So they don't have the freedom to do whatever they want. That's not, and whenever they put up something that's libelous, it has to be taken down. We have mechanisms to take down things that are intellectual property violations. I mean, so we figure this out in other areas. It's just a matter if the target in the video is seen to have an interest that's worthy of being protected, and that's right now. Their interests aren't being protected. We're just doing the producer versus the consumer.
Those platforms are privileged. They exist because of a privilege that the law provides them, and there's no reason why that has to happen. So, I mean,
Within the US, yeah. Within the U.S. context.
Within the U.S. context, right? I mean, they exist because we've allowed them to exist under law.
Yes, a question in the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Alvaro Marañón. A lot of the discussions you guys have been talking about hyper-targeting is reactive. It reflects deeper problems within society, and there are a lot of national security interests in that, having a smarter body, being able to be reactive to foreign threats. But what type of proactive responses do you think industry and governments could have here? Whether it be incentivizing them to change their ad distribution models, their blockchain, or different types of things, or incentivizing better resources for smaller regional newspapers who don't have the resources to be reactive to these type of threats. Thank you.
Small newspapers. I think local journalism. I love that idea, actually.
You think journalism's the answer?
No.
I'm just kidding. You're shaking your head. Yeah. No. I agree. I agree.
No, it's fair. I think it's part of it, but I
Yeah.
think journalism is sort of by definition reactive.
Yeah,
You're
it's true.
reporting on something that has happened, and so you can build up sort of a defense mechanism, like a defense mechanism to a virus, for example. But I don't think you can proactively build a dam with media. Although it's important just to create an information space that is more hostile to harmful deepfakes.
I guess I'd like to also say that social media and platforms is a science, and it can be studied and understood like we're trying to do here. And I think we could probably be more proactive in understanding more about it as, it's not entertainment. It is a part of our sociality and our culture, and so studying it that way, and then figuring out what are the positive levers. I think you're underplaying journalism. I think journalism and the standards of journalism for the large part of the 20th century were very, very, very important to functioning democracy, and so that shoring up that institution. I mean, let's just also talk about the lowering of government-funded grants to organizations that promote journalism and education and science over the past 3 decades has been devastating to universities doing this research and studying it as a science. So the idea of where we put our money to study these things, the wealth that has grown in this country has not gone to the studying of these things. It has gone to the businesses of these things, and so maybe we could reverse that.
One of the things that comes out of that last comment may be in some ways related to the libertarian sort of thesis that some of the early advocates of the internet's open architecture have promoted, and that I think we're seeing some of the consequences thereof. And so I wonder to what degree the sense of reinvesting in the underlying information architecture of the internet, specifically as a way of improving its democratic functions, might be one of the potential remedies. That is the interplay between industry and government. So not in an adversarial sense that, oh, well, the platform companies are the problem or have to be the solution, but rather we understand that there's a popular interest in recalibrating the underlying architectures of our information ecology. Right. So, I mean, that's a sort of synthesis. Yeah, down here.
This question will be primarily for Matt. With regards to national security, one of the last panels talked about, open sourcing a lot of this code and making it available for all to use, which has seen tremendous benefits, but also made it readily available to both governments and also non-state actors. And so from the defense perspective, what are you doing to prepare against attacks from non-state actors, from governments who might be adversarial to ours? And then what are you telling senior leadership within the armed forces to be prepared for and to be ready and to, like be on the, what's coming on the horizon, what do they need to be on the, be on the front foot for and not be caught off guard if an attack were to come via some sort of audited or, faked image or video?
So, what are we doing from a defense standpoint? So certainly, as I think Ed and Pat mentioned, DARPA invested in a media forensics program in 2016 that started that summer. It was actually started by a previous program manager at DARPA. That's been a considerable investment. It's over $68 million over those 4 years. And we continue to invest in that space with the upcoming semantic forensics program. I think there's a great question about the role of open source here. The previous panel talked about that a bit. And there are trade-offs. There's certainly folks that will advocate for the security through obscurity model. I've been more advocating for trying to make those defenses as broadly available as possible. So from an aspirational standpoint, I think if we could take disinformation as a whole off the table, that's actually a strategic and tactical advantage for the US, and it's actually a disadvantage for some of our adversaries who rely on restricting the flow of information within their countries. And so, a great outcome would be, can I get these defensive technologies into countries where, they have more adversarial control over their media? But I think we also need it just broadly for our diplomatic relations with other countries. If we had sort of, high-end manipulation detection technology that another country didn't have, and we're in a diplomatic process with them, and a third party, either a nation state or an individual, comes along and wants to disrupt that, we can tell that it's been disrupted within the US government, but that other country can't. Would they believe us if we told them? So I think that's another reason why we need these technologies broadly available. In terms of I think another part of your question is let's say just broadly speaking, what's coming, right? We've talked about hyper-targeting. Think about the Madison Avenue, the most hyper-targeted ad campaign in combination with the ability to generate any type of synthetic media, text, image, video, audio. That's the sort of thing that is potentially on the horizon. There's already an interesting concept out there called ransom fake. So this hasn't been implemented. It's been talked about in the press, and it's basically a synthetic blackmail attack. I'm going to destroy your reputation with this forged evidence unless you pay me money. So ransom fake, it's ransomware plus deepfake is basically the... imagine being able to do that at scale, right? Using big data techniques to harvest information from platforms or other places and then combine that with targeted media. So those sorts of things are on the horizon. One thing that I'll throw out there, in addition, this is part of the reason why we need automated techniques, is to deal with that volume and scale. But I think we also need to build a community to help debunk, fact check. If there is a critical event around this sort of thing that happens in the US, there's not one organization that can stand up and say, well, that was true or that was false or whatever. We really need to have a broad-based coalition, which includes US government and law enforcement and journalism and the platforms. Essentially, it's distributing the responsibility, or you might think about it in an insurance model, distributing the risk for saying that this is actually an attack. And so I guess that'll be my contribution to sort of the more policy side, to throw that out there as an idea.
I think who would believe us question is really hard. Even if you have the very best detection methods, once you find something, how do you share that information? Does it come from the government? Mm-hmm. Is there enough trust in government to, for people to take that at face value? Does it come from media? Certainly is less trust in media than there was before. If it comes from a coalition, does that actually, bring down the trust level? Because then there's kind of a strange interplay between media and government that doesn't usually exist. So that's a whole new level, like beyond detection, that I don't that we've had to deal with yet.
So I think that'll draw our panel to a close. I would simply say I think one of the things that we've heard emerging is the sense, called out maybe earlier also, is the sense that velocity matters a lot, right? And that detection and collaboration between the different stakeholders also matters a lot. One thing we maybe haven't had a chance to talk about, but may present a useful transition for us, is also to think about how deepfakes persuade. So to think not just about detection, but also the effect on the, not just the target as well, but the effect on the consumer, as it were, the person who receives this information, how it persuades, why it persuades, and then what kind of institutions, what kind of strategies and habits we might try to begin promoting, so that if we understand how a deepfake persuades, whether it's confirming bias or creating harm or creating other forms of action, we also are starting to build the institutions to make the end user or the recipient more resilient, more critical, right? And that may be a sort of democratic education project. But I think we ought to also recall that how this stuff works at the end user level. But with that in mind, please join me in thanking our very distinguished panel.